Now that our Sharpie is done, we're going to move on to the final details of our Dragonfly composition. We are going to do two techniques here. We're going to do what's called dry on dry watercolor, which we'll talk about more when we get there. But basically we're just going to use little spots of watercolor to kind of enhance our painting in a few small areas. Then we're going to use some chalk pastel to draw and kind of follow some of the organic curvy lines in the background. I've done it on this one, and I've done it on my cool color example as well. Okay, so to get started, what you're going to do is you're going to need some chalk pastels. The chalk pastels come in this little container like that, and you're going to choose colors that are warm for your background and cool for your wings. One thing about chalk pastels is sometimes you find some softer ones that work really nicely, and sometimes there's harder ones in here, and you want to rub them on a paper towel to kind of clean off the shiny edge, and that'll give you more chalk feel to work with. So I'm going to choose warm colors since that's what my background are made out of. There's some pink and red and yellow and an orange and an orange red here. Alright, so there's some warm colors for me to work with. I'm going to set those aside, and then I'm going to look at my background, and you can kind of see, like right here, there's this kind of edge that we've created from the orange color and the yellow color in the background. The whole purpose of this part is to kind of exploit or use those edges that are naturally there to kind of create some interest in your picture. So I'm going to be using mostly the long flat side of my chalk pastels. You can use the tip, but then it sometimes looks a little bit too much like a drawing. Okay, so you don't want to use the corner, you want to use a flat side. Then I'm going to take this and I'm going to roll it right around this edge and swoop it up like this, and that's going to really kind of create that line a little bit more than what it was there. I'm going to take this yellow and kind of use that as well and just kind of follow that same line. Alright, I'm going to swoop it down there too. Then I got this line right here where those two watercolors came together. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to pull it this direction. Okay, and this is the magenta color, different from the first ones that I used. I'm going to get this orange right next to it here. Oh, you can hardly see that. Let's go to a red orange here. And notice how I'm kind of cleaning them all off on this paper towel I have so I don't get yucky, dirty colors. There we go, that's a little better. Yucky, dirty colors on there like a blue or something in my warm background. Alright, I'll do another one right down here with some yellow. And you can kind of see how that's going to create a different feel to the background. It's going to create the kind of swoopy lines that we have in my first example. Okay, I'm going to do some up here. I kind of like that magenta color. It goes well with my sensibility for this painting. And what's going to happen is you'll notice that right here, where the chalk pastel goes on the top of the texture of the paper, it will show then the watercolor through just a little bit. And do that. Leave that paint shining through there rather than fully coloring it in. You don't want to color it in all the way and have it just be the chalk. You want it to show a little of that paper texture on there. Okay, so there's kind of the creating of that swirly background, and then I'm going to go back with a little bit of light violet in the wings. You can choose one or two cool colors or warm colors for your wings, and I'm just going to kind of go right over the surface, and you'll see again that we get that kind of textured feel from the paper, and that's going to make it look really, that'll make more interest happen. You see how the violet and the blue kind of interact there, and I'm going to do it again over here. Alright, so I don't want to completely cover over it, and I don't want to ruin any of those little pinholes that we created from our salt. But I want to just create kind of a more flowy background. Now that that's done, I'm going to take a watercolor brush and I'm going to do what's called dry on dry. And that means I have a dry brush. So here's my watercolor brush. I'm going to use the detail one and dry it off a little bit. Then I'm going to go back and I'm going to get dry paint. I don't want it to be too watery. I don't want it to be watery at all, in fact. I want it to be dry. And then I'm going to lay it right into these smaller shapes. And of course, I'm using a detail brush. Why? Because these shapes are small. Okay, you don't want to use a big brush. You want to use a small brush, and you want to keep your brush very dry because the paint on the surface of our painting is dry, right? And our brush is also dry. Okay, it has a little bit of watercolor paint on it, but it's dry watercolor paint. And the whole purpose of dry on dry is to cover over what you've got from your wet on wet watercolor wash. Now, do you always necessarily want to cover over with dry on dry? No, you can do thin washes of dry on dry as long as you keep your brush dry. And so even just looking right here, you'll see a little difference between this spot and this one, where the paint was a little thicker on the first one and then it got a little thinner by the end there. So you can make your paint a little thicker to conceal the color, or you can let it be a little bit wetter to have the color, the original color, show through ever so slightly. And I'm just going to stick with one color. I'm going to stick with my violet, and I'm going to put the little circle right there and the little circle right here so that those spots are different than everything else. And then I'm going to go and I'm going to do the little spots on my antenna. And those are going to stick out a lot because it's cool colors on a warm background. Okay, so that being finished, that is all we need to do for our dragonfly picture. That's done now. Then once you're done, make sure that you do two things. Number one, wash your colors or your paintbrush out and clean up all your supplies. Number two, when you're putting away your dragonfly picture, make sure not to smear the pastel, because the pastel is just chalk sitting on the surface, and if you take your finger, you'll smear it and it will make a big mess, and then it won't look very nice, and it's hard to erase and fix it once you've smeared it too much. So be very careful with your hands as you're working too, not to smear it, or your fingers. Okay? And that's how we conclude our dragonfly mixed media watercolor painting.